Son. Well, I look forward to having Benno join us on this one because he'll bring a president's view to this same challenging topic. Basically, what we're talking about here is a professor using the classroom for political purposes, for material outside the scope of the course. You've got a number of cases here on page 72, 73, 74. Professors not giving appropriate respect to the student viewpoint, indeed kind of overwhelming pressure on the student. They're all kind of similar to me, which would be what are the appropriate boundaries for extraneous material coming into the classroom, and appropriate boundaries for professors' respect for student opinion. We do have some things from the original documents that might be useful for our consideration here. Just went back through, well, what do we know from the tradition about these subjects? So if you don't mind, it's just a couple of things, but they are highly relevant to the inquiry. So if you go all the way back to the 1915 statement, or declaration, the 1915 declaration, you actually have specific, now remember, what is the 1915 declaration? The 1915 declaration is the professorate making its best argument to the boards and the administrators that the boards should agree to give space for academic freedom. That's what that 1915 state declaration is. It's the professorate speaking to their employers, trying to see, will you give us the professional autonomy that we need in order to serve the dissemination of knowledge and the creation of knowledge. It really isn't until now you get 25 years there of sort of a off and on negotiation between the boards and the administrators and the professorate, and then we get to the 1940 statement where we have both sides, at least in the 40 statement, you have the what we now call the AAC&U, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, agreeing on behalf of the employers, with the AAUP as to what the outlines of this academic freedom will be. So really, I think that when you look, now we're going to celebrate 2015 will be the 100th anniversary of the professorate speaking to the board. That's why I'm getting more drawn to my earlier suggestion that it's an opportunity now for the board perhaps to speak back to the professorate 100 years into this. And how many years then? It would be 72 years after the 1940 statement. We want to reflect on how the deal now looks from our perspective. Just a thought. But here's the 1915 statement, the professorate speaking to the boards. Scholarly standards include the following duties of inquiry and argument, and I'm quoting now from the 15 declaration: to gather evidence relevant to the issue at hand through thorough and painstaking inquiry, and then to set forth without misrepresentation or distortion the divergent evidence and propositions of other investigators. So that's what we were saying 100 years ago to the boards. And then the 1940 statement. Now, this was very, very robustly debated, but specific duty that teachers should be careful not to introduce into their teaching controversial material that has no relation to their subject. That also appears in the 1970 AAUP Statement on Freedom and Responsibility, where the modifier persistently is added. Same language, but modifying it with persistently. And then these are now, what should you call this, sort of from a legal standpoint, these would be other literature that reflects, I think, influential literature reflecting on this. Here's Carnegie Foundation and the Scholarship assessed the evaluation of the professorate 1997, saying that the scholar should always show that he or she has adequately considered existing scholarship in the field. Does the scholar use appropriate methodology recognized by the field, including the rules of evidence and the principles of logical reasoning? So now we're getting thrown into what would the professorate itself accept as right? Thorough and professional collection of the evidence and thorough and principled consideration of the evidence, including the opposing views. That's Carnegie in 1997. So those are some data points on where we have been on this. When you try to apply those to this problem of how far can a professor go to introduce political views into the classroom, I think that was the first question that you wanted us to, actually the first question on page 75. Does academic freedom allow professors to share political views or discuss controversial material in the classroom? Under what circumstances is it appropriate or inappropriate? Let me throw that out. I mean, what are the views? We had a lot of experience in the room. Yes?
Graduate school where I got my PhD, and then the 3 universities where I taught, there was never any session where this was discussed among the faculty. I mean, maybe some episodes came about and where some principles were maybe mentioned, but as a teacher, as a young teacher, and later on, there was never any discussion of these principles. So to what extent are teachers even taught to consider these principles?
My data shows we aren't, but in any case, at least
I read about them in the press or in the ACTA publication and so on, but at the schools where I was, this was never formally discussed.
Okay. Any other thoughts of the academics? Don, any reaction to this? Where would you put the outer bound? Where would you put this outer boundary? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, please.
Well, I always told students in a methodology course I was teaching in history, pay attention to your and develop your inner censor. And that is when you realize that and I cannot believe for the life of me that people don't realize what they are saying when they're saying it. When you realize you may be overstepping the bounds of exactly what were mentioned in those prescriptions that you just gave. But self-awareness is just terribly important, and since most academics are terribly self-aware anyway, I think that it's a wise thing to encourage when you are teaching graduate seminars, for example, where you have the graduate student more or less at your command. But in truth, there's a matter of conscience that's involved here. And that's really the problem of how we develop this.
I mean, we're right. What your comment goes right to that diagram that I gave you earlier, which is what you were looking at in that diagram is, and you can use it for all professions. I just gave a speech to the Minnesota National Guard, so it's the same for military officers. All you'd substitute is on the right column there, if you look at that diagram, I've put in the ideals and the core principles of the academic profession, which Desiree, I sent that around earlier, so just look on with your neighbor if you can't find it right now. But you can just see, you substitute out whatever, any profession has that same group, and if there's disagreement over what should be on that right side, the discussion itself would be highly therapeutic for the group to discuss, well, what goes in there, because basically once you're into that space, you're saying, well, then there are some first principles into which we should acculturate. So essentially the diagram is an onion. Imagine as an onion where the outer layers are the most visible, so at least with law, that's where we would have the rules of professional conduct, and we would hold each other accountable and discipline each other for failures to meet the rules, okay? Now, and physicians would have that, as we discussed earlier, the professors, that's, at least in the current world, we don't have strong agreement even on what the floor is among the professors. But it'd be highly therapeutic to start moving that direction to see, well, where could we get agreement? And then the rest of it would be the ideals and core principles. So over a course of a career, one is living into it. And the core of it is your personal conscience that you brought in to graduate school, which is, I'm using a 4-component model out of moral psychology there. So whatever the student's existing moral core is, you're asking them to internalize into the core principle, at least to be rules compliant, and then internalize into the core principles and ideals of the profession over a lifetime. Yeah.
And so if your conscience has been guided, if you will, by modern education, preschool through high school, and your conscience brings you to the doorstep of a teacher's ed college today.
Right.
And then you graduate from that ed college, and your conscience says social justice and social activism and social re-engineering is the core belief of my conscience, then these rules would have no appeal. And it's perhaps not so much that they don't understand these rules or these concepts, they don't like them. They can't embrace them, perhaps because their conscience, as they've grown in the world, absent an understanding, a clean understanding of American history, absent a cleaner understanding of the social contract, perhaps, their conscience says we must prevail, we must change the culture, change society, that constitution, pish-tush, what does that mean? We don't need that. We have a new order in mind. Is that part of what we're dealing with?
That is what we're dealing with. But a term for this would be, let me give you some terms that I think are synonyms. Bill, some of you might have run into Bill Sullivan, who, anybody that, I think the lawyers in the room, Bill Sullivan was the author of Educating Lawyers. He was the co-director of Carnegie Foundation's series of studies on educating for the profession. So Carnegie, starting in 2000 and then ending in 2010, did a series of studies on how do we educate into the profession. So they did clergy, law, physicians, nursing, engineering, and then they added business education. So actually 6 studies at the end of the day. And Bill's comment was, well, one way to capture, they try to find terms that capture the heart of this. I don't want to repeat too much, but they divided it into 3 apprenticeships. That all the professions involve a cognitive apprenticeship, that's learning the doctrinal knowledge and the analytical skill unique to that profession, although it all builds off of what we'd be doing in the liberal arts, which is the critical thinking. And then the rest of the skills of that profession, the practical skills of that profession, they called the practical apprenticeship. And then they felt that the core of the matter, though, was what they called professionalism or professional formation or ethical professional identity, which is that moral core informed by the core principles. So Bill came to call that a fiduciary disposition, okay, which would be this internalization. It's the move from narcissism towards responsibility for others. In a faith language, it's love of neighbor, but there's lots of different synonyms you can use here. All of you who are parents know that that's what we're doing from somewhere early, trying to move from help the person move from a narcissism towards another directedness, a much, if you want to use secular terms, a much deeper and richer understanding of the complexity of human flourishing together. That's the project. I mean, liberal arts historically were huge there, as was all the cultural institutions. And I think your point is we're struggling. I think that's the heart of your point. Yes.
See, sorry, I speak softly. I think the real issue is who we are and what are your values. We talked about John Locke. I was a philosophy major. I understand Locke, but perhaps I'm more 20th century existentialism to the extent that I believe it's what your values are on the ground. And I think once you determine your values, everything else will flow through. So, and values perhaps change, or maybe they don't. But even with academic freedom, what is it to you, and why is it important? Because I could sit in a room a day from now with a group of totally different, not trustees, maybe a different set of individuals, and they'll have a whole different take and stance on what academic freedom is, probably to the left of perhaps where we are today. So I think that to be really reflective, we all have to recognize that we all have biases. And the issue is, what is your real starting point? And just be honest about it. And once you get to that starting point, then you can say, these are, just like with my children, here are my values. I have these Christian values. I think they are important. I will give them to you, but recognize that when I deal with them, I have a starting point, and I think that is a critical issue. So I'm a trustee member at Pace University. I sit on the board, but I'm also chair of the Student Affairs Committee. I happen to be African American. I've also been a conservative Republican for 20 years, long time ago, before I got to Harvard, before I experienced a lot of things. And the interesting thing is, during a lot of our meetings, because I'm African American, the other members on the committee think I subscribe to certain values, which I don't. I actually subscribe to open values, which I always talk to them about. But the issue is, what are your values?
Yes, I have a comment. Yeah.
I concur. I don't think that, I think the pretense of neutrality is part of the problem here. That, you know, bias in the classroom isn't just what the teachers, professors say, whether they're overstepping some boundary. It goes all the way down to the materials that are selected and to the materials that are omitted. And so it seems like I agree with what you're saying, that intellectual honesty would require a professor to kind of say, look, I'm a Marxist. And part of what's incumbent upon me as a professor is to give you the Marxist view and the very best of an opposing view. You know, when in the classroom, this is what I had to do routinely, you know, and teach my students to ask that question in any class. You should be able to ask your professor, I hear what you're saying, what's the very best of an opposing view? And hold them accountable to that.
Well, I mean, my sense is that's how, certainly, I also have been teaching 38 years. I don't recall any specific acculturation into this academic ethics except by observing the senior peoples, essentially. I think that's how it worked, to the degree it worked at all. But I always felt that I had to do that that's what we did. I think that would be, many colleagues wouldn't, especially the issue of the opposing view, that you'd give some space for the robust opposing view. I think that would be where the disagreement would come in.
I know, yeah, I mean, I remember taking a class at Davidson on the American welfare system, and every single source was of a certain, there was no discussion. And this is gross abrogation of duty, I think. It's not, it doesn't matter if my professor is a socialist or Marxist. I don't care. I'm happy to have a professor who's a Marxist. I just want them to be upfront about it and give the opposing views. And it seems that that is something that trustees might be able to exert some pressure on. You know, I think Philip mentioned this. Hiring is really the key, because by the time the tenure decisions are handed out, there whole swaths of the population hasn't even been interviewed. I mean, they haven't even been hired in the first place. So maybe trustees can exert some pressure on the culture of a department.
Do you have any comment on this from kind of FIRE's perspective, on how you would move the professorate more towards having, you know, a norm of exploring the other side's views, right, not just the one view? Do we have the, where's the mic? Great.
I mean, I talk a lot about this in the book, and I feel like we're dealing with a much larger problem. And I think the thing that's interesting is, as she remarked, that if you take some of these values seriously, like some of these professors do, they feel like they have they lack epistemological modesty. They believe they're putting. They believe that they're, and like I believe you said, that we have a religious university again, in a sense that that sort of the function of the professor is to put truth into the ignorant. And the idea that there's any duty of modesty of what you know on the part of professors is considered to be somewhat passé. So there's really we really got to start from real fundamentals. Not the least of which is, you know, and I try to get back to like how early we have to teach this stuff. That when you have the system where the whole idea is that there's a single truth as represented by the professors, then debate and discussion is pointless. You know, it's just you have to actually show how much you believe in this. But teaching debate and discussion, and for that matter, showing that debate and discussion can actually be fun as at early ages as possible, can make quite a difference. Because the way we currently do it on campus is we put such graveness around disagreement. There's something I talk about in the book where resident hall officials are literally stopping people from having debates because they see no point to it. They are empowered to actually go and stop people from arguing because what's the point? You just have differing points of view. And this is a fundamentally, wrong attitude. So I think we can't start early enough in teaching people that debate and discussion can be fun. But when we continue to have professors who place no value in, particularly when you have concepts like false consciousness, like the idea that basically, well, you're all sexist and racist and homophobic fundamentally, and I'm here to put truth in you, the revealed truth. That's a big fundamental part of the problem. And sometimes pointing out, something that I try to point out as a First Amendment lawyer, is that the First Amendment is ultimately about humility. I know I'm not omniscient, and I suspect nobody else is either. And if that's the case, then there's a value in hearing each other out. But that's an idea that's gone out of fashion, particularly on universities.
I think one reason for that is because we lose touch with how do we establish the authority of one perspective over another. So if I'm teaching content ethics, like I mentioned, I'll bring up things like a pragmatic ethics and a hygienic basis for ethics, an aesthetic basis for ethics. If it feels good, do it, and then contrast it with Kant's notion based on principles and a metaphysical one, and show the difference, and then let them work it out, which is more coherent and which makes more sense. And you can see one is, would you trust someone to babysit for your child or something if they're living according to a code based on aesthetics or pragmatics or this sort of thing. So even though if you're teaching just one perspective, but what I was getting at before was how does one establish the authority of, unless you say none of them has any authority, so that you can just always argue. And lots of students will write on the paper, well, Kant's opinion, it's not an opinion, okay? It's a systematically worked out doctrine. And if you follow it, you see how it goes. You can deny it or whatever you want, but to throw it out is just to walk away, not to think it through. And I think that's quickly lost sight of when we want to be fair to give all these other points of view. Sure, fairness, but within the framework of establishing a basis for the authority of leading, whether it's Tocqueville or Kant or orientations.
I'm going to count on Benno to give me a heads up. I can't see you back there, so if you want to jump in, please.
I agree with what you just said, but I think there's like a trade-off. I don't think any one professor is capable of presenting all sides to an issue, even if they're fair-minded as possible, simply because the amount of time to learn alternative viewpoints is too great, and no one can really do it. But I think there's a separate problem which feeds into this, which is the peer review process, which is necessary to academic standards, but at the same time, by its own nature, creates a kind of Gresham's law of driving out alternative views. So if you have, not to pick on Kantians, but if you have a few Kantians in the department, suddenly anyone who questions Kant becomes a renegade and is wrong, and we're not going to allow that person to get tenure. Of course, it's not usually, Kant is not usually the issue that we're talking about, but you see what I'm saying? So I think it's kind of like a make or buy kind of decision that, in other words, you can't really, I don't think it's right to ask someone who believes in Marxism to try to give a rendition of Adam Smith. I think what you need to do is hire someone who believes in Adam Smith so the students can take both professors and get good renditions of both. But what happens is, and it's a very, I don't know if it's possible to solve, that the peer review process makes that kind of balance difficult. And I wonder if the trustees can somehow redress that in a way, but I don't know how. I certainly don't believe in affirmative action for libertarians or something like that. But.
Well, one of the things that we recommend in our booklet is attempting to change the incentives. And Don and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, something that the trustees really can do in the position that they hold. One of the things that we suggest is that we should reward, and I think, Neil, you perhaps mentioned, or someone did, that we should reward those departments which are clearly open to disciplinary diversity, so students can get military history, diplomatic history, feminist history, social history, whatever, that these kinds of departments be rewarded So I would think that that would be something that the board, working through the president, working through the provost, could implement. I've got a question for the faculty here, though. Let's assume, as in the case of the California matter, where the course description says conservatives not allowed. It's very clear that the reading list is biased, that students are not being presented with multiple perspectives, and you as a faculty member know this is taking place. I mean, we've already heard that self-governance is not working, but what would happen if self-governance were working? What should happen when you know your colleague is being irresponsible and you want to go about rectifying it internally?
Well, I'd start by wanting to make sure there's a clear line. And the California case at Berkeley, obviously that's a clear line. And it's political partisanship built into the syllabus, and it's utterly unacceptable. Moving toward a more moderate version of that, then it's a little more, I'm going to defer to the faculty member. We had a case in Wisconsin where a group of designated faculty, one of the most eminent people on campus, who's now retired, sent out an email to every faculty member saying, here's what you should do with your class. Start by saying there are certain views that should be considered problematic because of the value of sensitivity. And they also recommended that we submit our syllabi for scrutiny. And our group immediately went and posed that. I had lunch with the guy behind it, and they ended up dropping it because we threatened to make a deal out of it. I don't want that person scrutinizing my syllabi. And that leads to the larger question of, trust. We can all agree on a certain point, but, if you take constitutional law, one of the first questions you always ask is, who decides? First Amendment issue, who decides? So I want the marketplace to do it, not some authority. Should it be the court? Should it be the president? Should it be Congress? And it's sort of the same thing here. Who decides, and can we trust? Have you read the book by Mary Lefkowitz, History Lessons? It's a great book. It's about a guy who's pretty much committing academic fraud by teaching a book similar to the Protocol of the Elders of Zion. It was called The Secret Life of Blacks and Jews. And he was teaching it as a propaganda book. He was teaching it as historical fact. And she went through a laborious process. It took a few years, I think, for her finally to get that course. They talked to the professor. He couldn't teach it that way anymore. And I remember reading that, and I said, yeah, I'm with her. But I was somewhat troubled because do I want that done to my course on a politically correct campus? So it's difficult to know when a line is crossed and who's going to make that determination. Clearly in the California case, yeah, it was crossed, and I would have opposed that. But then you got a clear academic freedom of students issue going on there.
If one's concerned about minority views, or one takes minority views oneself, the last thing one wants to do is to empower any institution. And this is an argument for limited governmental power. It's also true within these institutions. So to have the freedom, you have to be able to accept some of the immorality. The problem is when it's wholesale immorality, perhaps it's time to leave the institution. So there may not be a solution to this.
I want to push back a little bit on Don's comment, because I think as a colleague, now not speaking as a dean, but or as a president or administrator, just as a colleague, would I speak to somebody who I thought might be within the rules, but was clearly not within what I would consider the ideals of the profession in terms of the treatment of students? And we have this problem across all the professions. Do we speak to our colleagues about higher expectations than just a legal compliance call? And I hope so. I hope we are. So I feel my job, especially now that I'm in the mid-60s, that my job is actually to step up and do have a couple unpleasant conversations as a colleague. That would be
There are three levels.
Yeah.
One is where you defer, you don't say anything, out of professional courtesy or out of just academic freedom principle. First level, out of professional courtesy or better, out of academic freedom principle, you defer, you don't say anything to your colleague. Second level, yeah, you talk to the colleague informally. A lot of these problems can be dealt with by talking to your colleagues, telling them your problem, but you don't get coercive. And then the third level is when you actually do something about it in a more formal respect. The big problem with speech codes, I mean, a lot of problems obviously, but one of them was that they were coercive. They were criminalizing differences. And I think a lot could be done through discussion, and a lot of faculty members are actually have enough goodwill to listen to something like that, especially if you make the case for the students. So you got to keep aware of those 3 different levels.
Right. That loops back to the comment earlier. It's Judy's comment, your comment about how do we engage. That at the back side of that diagram, that onion diagram, this is, I have to say, this is early stage research, but nonetheless it tends toward some convergence. This would be, when we're in that 3rd apprenticeship space, how do you help somebody internalize this move from narcissism towards responsibility for others in the context of a profession? So what you see on this page is, well, what do we know empirically about strategies that are most effective? You can see that, well, one thing, we can't find any data that shows one-time programs do anything that we can assess. So just floating in a one-time program in academic freedom or whatever, anything in this space will do nothing. Fear-based programs don't seem to show any assessable difference. It has to be something that asks the person, well, how does whatever the material is mean for me in this formation space? It has to be an internal, is a reflection process. So there's a moral dialogue with other adults, and then there's a reflection process. If you go down the various findings here, go down to 1, it's in the table 3, 1B, creating an optimal conflict to challenge each student's existing ideas. Here's why you actually do want a classroom that has at least the major opposing views. Because what happens, I think, well, this is the best we know. This is out of Harvard. This is Robert Keegan's work. If you ask how does adult moral development occur, your existing worldview is challenged by another model. Use very lay terms. I mean, you let the other person's words sit on your heart, and you actually reflect on it. And as best we can tell, you will grow. That reflection process will grow into much richer understandings of human flourishing. It isn't to say there aren't absolute truth claims in there, or at least very robust truth claims. It's just that that's the best strategy. Now, as a teacher, I can say, having tried this now for 25 years, just you always have to go where the student is. So they may be a terribly narcissistic stage. It doesn't matter. You are going to get nowhere unless you go there and then try to ask a question. This is what all you parents are doing. You're asking a question roughly half a stage above, later than where the child or the student is in terms of consideration of others and all the complexity that would go into a decision. I've actually seen I've been, as I say, been around to 10 different law schools, and I've been to a lot of classrooms. I've seen some unbelievably good teaching in this space. This is Socratic dialogue in its truest and robust sense, always asking questions just to provoke thought process, whatever the text is. It can be done. And again, are they coming to us at a more narcissistic stage than was true 20 years ago? I see some mixed data on that, frankly. We don't have much assessment on that, frankly, but it doesn't really matter, does it? We're going to have to go wherever they are. That would be, yes.
Unless the narcissism is reinforced by some of the conventions that are being broadly accepted, such as the RA who suppresses discussion and debate. With narcissism, one classic hallmark is the individual cannot bear someone who differs with them. So discussing and debating differences causes them to fall apart, and they just can't deal with that. And more we seem to see policies and protocols developed that almost reinforce the validity of narcissistic thinking and behavior. I wonder.
Philip, did I understand you to say that you believe that that the individual faculty members should have full control of the content of his or her classroom, including the syllabus and how things are done, what's discussed, what's read, without any review on an institutional level? Because review. Could you restate your?
It seems to me there's a range of possible ways of organizing this. Clearly, there has to be some freedom for the teacher, otherwise it's going to be a dreary class. But obviously, a department, a law school will review each class and at least an initial syllabus or a plan for a class to determine whether or not it's relevant and needed. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And obviously, teachers should not go into irrelevancies or pursue personal agendas. In fact, I would actually disagree with the suggestion that one can only teach one's own point of view. I teach Ottoman and early Islamic views of the millet system, and you know something? I hope I do it sympathetically, even though it is hardly my view of religious liberty. So it strikes me that this is all, it gets back to the culture. There should be freedom, but within the culture of actually respecting other people's points of view and trying to challenge one's own. And when you lose the culture, the freedom looks pretty thin. And there, I would agree with you, we've got problems. But if one then has to turn to government coercion, or in this case, university coercion, then you're defeating the very freedom that you want to flourish in our culture.
Yeah.
So I don't know the way out of that problem.
Well, I'm skeptical of that point of view, I must say. I think the university has a legitimate, indeed a necessary institutional role at two ends of the process. I think first, there's a course of study committee that's beyond the department that needs to review every course, every syllabus, the content, for balance and for whether the faculty member has the expertise and so on. But beyond that, I think there needs to be a complaint system where students or faculty, for that matter, who have complaints about the behavior of a professor in a class, or if a professor has a complaint about a student, has access to a complaints process for the students. I think it's important that give them the option of anonymity, where a group of faculty, I would have the decision-making dominated, I think, by faculty, but faculty, administrators, some students, can review the allegations and decide if there's merit and if the faculty member needs to be spoken to or even reprimanded or whatnot. We set that up at CUNY because we were getting a lot of complaints about faculty behavior with students in certain areas of the curriculum. But since we set up the process, I think that itself had a kind of healthy preventive effect. We haven't had any complaints since we set this process up about 3 years ago. It was very controversial when we did it. There was a lot of opposition from the faculty on the ground that students would use this in a punitive way. But I think having a complaint system so that you have both some university oversight of the content of the course before it's offered, and a complaint system that protects students from inappropriate faculty behavior, including this kind of indoctrination and irrelevant points of view being introduced. I think that's a healthy thing. And I think faculty being aware that such a thing exists, it may inhibit their own tendency to get involved in irrelevant personal points of view and so on, ideological browbeating and whatnot in the classroom.
Just a question, though, then. This sounds very appealing, but whom do you complain to about the oppressiveness of the complaint system? And I raise this because there are all sorts of complaint systems already in place, for example, for using offensive language that creates a hostile work environment, which clearly suppresses speech. And no one wants to oppose it because the federal government is encouraging it, and the administrators are encouraging it, and the majority of faculty is encouraging it. And fortunately, I'm at an institution where I'm pretty confident it's not going to be misapplied. But I expect in other departments and schools, one could see these institutions veering out of control themselves.
Well,
I just don't know that.
I mean, I think whenever you set up a complaint system for anything, you need to review it. And when we set up this complaint system essentially for students who complaining about professors doing inappropriate things in the classroom. We asked the general counsel of the university to keep an eye on the complaints, what happens to them, and to report back to us on whether he thought the process itself was having a chilling effect on faculty freedom. And so far, at least, he has reported, number one, that there are many fewer complaints than we expected, and number two, that he's had no member of the faculty come forward and make such a claim. So that doesn't, you know, I admit that that's not 100%
Great confidence
persuasive.
institution that you oversee, but there are many others.
But I think it's a reasonably good way to balance the fact that students, in my view at least, we've taken this view at CUNY, definitely have rights in the classroom. And that those need to be protected from the tendency of some faculty members to go off on their own personal, you know, ideological hobby horse.
And here, yeah. Yes.
Consequence of enfeebling human agency. So, you know, why can't we train young people to say, I don't like it when you laugh at my beliefs, or, you know, it's uncomfortable for me when X, Y, Z. And I think, is this not an angle that trustees could take of, we're raising leadership, are we, you know, not, you know, encouraging people to find a voice? It's really demeaning when you think about it. And I can't help but think it has not only a negative effect on the formation, on the culture, but also ultimately on political democracy if you can't engage.
Is there another hand? Yeah. I wanted just to pick up one theme there that Benno had, and that is like the case on page 73, the Brandeis case. I mean, here, as I understand the case, it was no faculty involvement, just the harassment bureaucracy, which I think, I mean, you're definitely.
No, I think the faculty should play the dominant role in any complaint procedure around faculty conduct. But I think there needs to be others on the committee to make sure that the faculty people who serve do an honest and fair job.
Are there any other comments that people want to make on this? Yeah, please.
Or it's unintentional, in the sense that we teach world things now, way beyond American things. You know, you've all been aware of that debate. I'm all for international studies and all that, but we've downgraded American studies, American virtues, you know, that kind of thing. And so students aren't being exposed to it. And it also kind of reinforces their narcissism, because they're by not being exposed to American values, they're not being exposed to the virtues that you think they should have. And this is coming also from the very top. I mean, Greg can tell you stories about this. The standard for sexual misconduct on campus, which is, they had a Wall Street Journal piece on it last week that was very well, highly read, and it's preponderance of the evidence. These are kangaroo courts. And so there's a variety of directions in which we're not doing the kind of thing you're talking about. And it leads to an unintentional consequence of narcissism, because those other virtues are not there to counter it.
And before we break, if I could follow up on that, we're not looking at this particular case study, but there are two case studies involving boards of trustees looking at curricular issues and providing oversight. This issue of, for instance, whether or not students should study American history, or whether they should know more about constitutionalism when they're at colleges and universities. Virtually no school these days requires that of these graduates. And so some boards have decided they want to address this, working with faculty who've come up with curricular proposals. In the case of George Mason, the Board of Trustees agreed with the faculty proposal for the most part, but felt that American history and Western civilization should be added. They then said that they felt every graduate at George Mason should know who George Mason is. Now, what happened? The faculty had a vote of no confidence, but in fact, the boards stood firm and said, we're not going to be dictating what you do in that classroom, but we do want to insist that these kinds of courses be taught. I think this, again, is an area where trustees can tread. They have to tread softly and carefully because they cannot dictate what the professor is going to put on his syllabus, but they can certainly say that they want their institutions to have every graduate taking an American history course or a political science course about America so that we start to address these civility issues that you're talking about. Absolutely, and I've got to say we have Candace DeRusi, who was part of the SUNY board, which did this and also found a great deal of pushback. But I do think that, again, this is an area where trustees can very legitimately become involved at the oversight level in ways that I think are beneficial. At this point, we're going to take a brief break, and then we're going to come back at 2:45 for an open discussion.